Hi there, it's Ron Gula with another episode of the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction Show. Today, we are going to interview the author of Cyber War and Peace, Nick Shevelyov. Nick, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Ron. How are you?
Great. I appreciate you joining us on the show today. You're currently wrapping up a 15-year career at Silicon Valley Bank. I think a lot of folks in the cyber industry are interested in what you're going to do next. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what led you to write the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit about my background is born in the United States, but as a child moved back to the Soviet Union. And at the time during the Cold War, for various reasons, we were viewed as being spies. And so we lived in a bugged apartment, and the KGB had assigned some people to follow us around. It was just an interesting period of time. And my father ended up publishing a book, and he got in trouble with the KGB and got interrogated. And so we left and came back to the United States. So that early sort of childhood experience taught me how your security and your privacy can be infringed upon. In fact, I learned as a kid that when you had something important to say, you run water and you talk over running water because the bugs in the apartment can't hear what you're saying. So that influenced me. And as a kid, I was just always interested in technology and was always sort of hacking around in the early days. And by the time I graduated college, I had a degree in economics, but an interest in technology. So I jumped into the tech industry and relatively early in my career began focusing on what we called cybersecurity today, but we called it IT security back in those days. And I went to work for a gentleman who had reverse engineered the William Morris worm back in '88 and had solved for it. And I did work for three-letter agencies as a contractor, breaking into networks, hardening them. Spent a number of years at Deloitte, sort of learning the balance between security and privacy. You can't have privacy without security. Too much security, you infringe on privacy. Saw some of the great brands around the world. And then I came to Silicon Valley Bank 15 years ago, at the time a small regional bank, and was proud to start their first security program as chief security officer, chief privacy officer, helped build out a global publicly traded financial institution that now does business all around the world, one of the top 10 banks in the United States. And over the course of time, I would speak at conferences and seminars, and I would talk about lessons from history and how they translate into technology risk management. People would come up to me and say, hey, you should write a book on this. I never had time. When the pandemic hit and we went into lockdown, I said, you know what, there's no time like the present. So I decided to write the book, taking lessons from history and translating them into controls as viewed by NIST, but good hygienic approaches that a business leader can understand. Published that in August of last year, donating all the proceeds to charity, and decided that this would be my last year at Silicon Valley Bank. So I'm wrapping up a 15-year career there where I was CISO, and then I was CIO for a few years, stepped back into the CISO role during the pandemic, and now I'm wrapping up 15 years this spring. So that's a little bit about my background, a little bit about the book, and again, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Ron.
Excellent. Well, thanks for going into that. So before we get into the book, for folks who are outside of the cyber sort of investing ecosystem, Silicon Valley Bank is a pretty crucial part of that ecosystem. So as CISO there, as Silicon Valley Bank made loans with these startups, how many cybersecurity startups, or just, other companies did you get to look at?
A lot. So most of my role historically has been defending the organization, protecting to enable, and it's been an operationally focused role, building out the teams, building out a global SOC, computer security, incident response, forensics, et cetera. But I also have advised our VC arm and looked at technology to see whether or not it was legitimate. And a lot of the companies that we've banked have been some of the darlings of the technology industry. Whether it's the relationship that we had with FireEye in the early days, or CrowdStrike, or Palo Alto Networks, we all work together in some form or fashion. So I get to see these companies early and give them my feedback on, what I think is working, what's not working, where is the industry going, and hopefully influence the direction so that they're developing products and solutions that Silicon Valley Bank can leverage. And it's a win-win type environment. So we have cultivated an ecosystem of mutual prosperity for innovators and entrepreneurs all over the world. And when they win, we win, and we make loans to them. In some cases, we take warrants, and if they go public and those warrants are worth something, then we make a profit, and we make loans out to them. And so there's lots of stories where it was an early stage company. The technology and the team looked very promising. They needed a little bit more runway. We've helped them out with that. It led to a success, and everyone wins. And so that's sort of the mindset, I think, is, setting up win-win relationships. And my technology stack, whether as CIO or as CSO, a lot of the tech stack ended up being our clients, not because they were our clients, but because they had innovative solutions that worked well for our needs. And then again, that becomes a win-win where your client is also your partner and your vendor. So everyone wins in that situation.
And you were never in a situation where you're like, all right, we're not going to extend you this line of credit unless you add this particular feature integration with CrowdStrike, right?
Never.
Well, I got my book from Don and Alberto over at Forge Point Capital. I think you not only do a lot of work for Silicon Valley Bank, but you also advise, I think, Forge Point, Forbes Technology Council. I think you're working with Dave DeWalt a little bit. So, I mean, you're very good for the industry. So, all right, so let's talk about the book. Read the book. I've read a lot of cyber books, and I always try to think about, who's the audience for these cyber books? Is it, are you trying to flex for the cyber people out there? Or are you trying to reach outside of that cyber bubble? And I really felt that this was outside of that cyber bubble, the general public. So, what inspired you to pull from history and kind of reach outside the bubble, so to speak?
If there was one word, I would say it's empathy, right? So many business leaders are so smart and so sharp in their domain of expertise, whether it's finance or it's human resources or business development, and they hear about this cybersecurity risk. And a lot of times things get lost in translation. So with a sense of empathy, I wanted to leverage the power of analogical storytelling to take a concept in history that you can get your sort of mind around and then translate it for that business leader into good technology hygiene so that they are empowered and informed so that they have a better discussion amongst themselves, with their peers, with their boards, and with their technology and security leaders. So you're right, Ron. I did not write this for the security practitioner. I wrote it for people outside of technology, outside of security, people who want to learn more about this space and can learn through the power of storytelling. What I found, even though this was my initial intent, security practitioners have approached me and said, hey, you know what? We're using this to tell a better story to get the outcome that we're looking for. And so that was refreshing as well. So yeah, definitely oriented at the business leader who's maybe in the San Francisco International Airport, hopping on a plane, flying to New York, want a quick understanding of cybersecurity, and they can get that in just a couple of hundred pages.
I actually recommend the book to a lot of different people. Anybody who's technical and has to reach that audience, whether it's a sales deal, they're trying to brief somebody outside of the community, or even like a K through 12 environment. They say, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it, but they never tell you how to apply it to new technology. And you did such a good job taking all these different aspects of history and applying them to NIST cybersecurity framework, MITRE ATT&CK, attack surface management and whatnot. I don't want to go through all of it because I'm encourage people to read the book, but let's at least talk about some of the ones you have in there. I think everybody's seen the movie 300, or they know about the Battle of Sparta. And, you really tied that to attack surface management. I thought that was brilliant. What kind of led you to write about that, and what kind of feedback have you received, with that analogy?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, people have seen the movie. I heard about the story as a boy. I was fascinated by ancient Greece and Rome. I start the book off with a Latin phrase the Romans had, "Civ invictum parabellum," those who wish for peace prepare for war. This chapter in particular was around picking your battles, right? And so picking your battles as an executive leader, picking your battles as a technologist, developing your architecture in the old on-prem world. Maybe you're forcing choke points and jump boxes where your administrators need to have step-up authentication to do highly sensitive work. And so the story on this chapter is the Persian Empire was invading Greece and was going to conquer the Greek city-states. And due to some timing issues, the Greek city-states were celebrating certain holidays. And so the Greek king, Leonidas, he took 300 Spartan soldiers and he chose to engage this million-man Persian army, not on a broad field, but in a very narrow space called the Hot Gates of Thermopylae. And so what happened was that the Persian army had to funnel that million-man army into a very narrow space. And those 300 Spartan soldiers were able to defend that space for 3 days and 3 nights. And so what's the lesson there? As the previous chapter talks about architecture, and that it leads into this next chapter on managing your attack surface, right? We grew up in this space thinking about it. I can't defend everything. How do I channel the battle into spaces where I can set myself up for wins? How can I have my SOC analysts have a clear view of the landscape? And how do I set us up so that I am focused those battles in places that I'm controlling? And so I mentioned in the traditional on-prem place, it's a little easier to do on-prem space. But in the cloud today, you can still configure your environments to channel access into secured environments, to require multi-factor authentication, to require identity and access management, having the right people have the right access to the right resources at the right time, and to require step-up authentication in the spirit of zero trust. Now, I'd be interested in your perspective here. It's an umbrella term on zero trust. If I got to rename zero trust, Ron, I might call it continuous trust validation, right? It's something where I can create a space where you want to do something. I'm going to validate that I trust you. And in this space, the Spartans funneled the attackers into that narrow space and were able to engage them. So it's a long-winded answer to that question on the 300.
Did you say that?
It's definitely a good analogy. What I wanted to push back on, or at least get your thoughts on here, Leonidas, he looks up and down, the terrain, and he picks that best spot to funnel the Persians. He chooses the point of battle. But for somebody who's like an executive and they've got their $500 million budget and their IT budget, it's kind of hard for them to walk into their CISO and say, hey, have we done least privilege use? Are we doing zero trust? I'm seeing a lot of people throw those terms around and have just as many, open ports and systems on Shodan as they did a year ago. So how do you actually tell people, like, when do you know you're done? When do you know that you've done enough to get the most advantage for the blue team, for the defenders?
Boy, you're never done, right? It's not a destination, it's a journey. And that journey is a process, and a process you need to really enjoy in managing your people, your process, and your technology with the mindset that 20% of it is broken to someplace. 20% of your stack is broken, and you have a continuous approach and a mindset that you're validating that your controls are working, and you're continuously exploring your environment to make sure that you've got the right inventory of assets, of systems, applications, of dependencies, that you're applying the right vulnerability management, you're prioritizing your burn rate on vulnerability remediation, you're taking that into context, and you're tackling your most sensitive resources and segments of your environment first and foremost. And so if I'm a business executive and I've got a budget to manage, I have to think about trade-offs. right? I need to make investments and I need to protect to enable. And what are those trade-offs where we can have those frank conversations? So I think speaking with transparency about the reality of the environment, but also understanding where within your organization do you have dimly lit hallways, and then lighting those pathways to understand this is part of our remediation plan. This is where we need to have well-lit pathways. This is where we need to reinforce certain controls and continuously validate those controls with a frequency and an efficacy related to the risk associated with that control.
For somebody who's an executive and they maybe, remember switching from, running Exchange platforms on premise to using Office 365 in the cloud, how do you do that sort of analysis when all your apps are in the cloud and maybe it's hard to go in and understand, are they configured correctly? Isn't Google secure, right? Some of those folks I run into, they just kind of assume the cloud's secure by default.
Yeah, just funny story. In the late 90s, I was an Exchange admin.
I'm sorry.
Accountable for it. Yeah. And what I got into the habit of doing is, because at the time, Exchange was the lifeblood of the organizations that I worked with. I got in the habit of being able to restore Exchange in my sleep. And the story here, I'll give you a historical analogy, is if you think about London, one of the great cities in the world, the geographic center in the middle of London stands Trafalgar Square. And there's 4 lion monuments. And in the middle of the square, there's a pillar. And at the top of the pillar, there's a statue. And that statue is of Lord Admiral Nelson, who won the Battle of Trafalgar. And he led a smaller fleet against Napoleon's fleet and defeated them in battle. And how did he go about doing that? Is he would drill his sailors day and night, so that during the battle, they were able to fire off 3 cannonballs for every 1 cannonball the French are able to fire off. And that just shows you practice, right? Exercising. And that comes to fruition when you're in a digital battle as well. So I did that early in my career. I had my teams do the same thing. So if there was ever a blip in the middle of the night, they could restore Exchange in their sleep. The way I would tell an executive today is that with the cloud, this is a shared accountability model in most cases, right? Is that the big cloud providers have an obligation to provide you certain services. Depending on what you adopt, if it's software as a service, more of the accountability is on their end. If it's infrastructure as a service, then there's more accountability on your end, and you need to develop infrastructure as code and change your mindset so that you're continuously standing up and standing down environments, which gives you greater optionality, greater ability to deliver more quickly. But that very optionality increases the number of things that you can do wrong, that a human being can make a mistake in. And human configuration errors are the number one risk facing cloud environments today. So it's about expanding your horizons and continuously learning and improving and adapting how the world is evolving to how you think about securing the cloud.
So let's expand on that a little bit. Another sort of historical analogy you have is Sun Tzu, right? Know yourself, you're going to beat the enemy, all the time. And that's definitely an analogy for everything from the NIST cybersecurity framework. First thing is asset control, all the way to, you can't protect what you can't see and know about and stuff. But in the case of the cloud, I might know that I'm at Salesforce. I might know that I'm at Dropbox. I might not know which of those two has their own data centers at Equinox, or, they're dependent upon Amazon. They're dependent, they've got, international issues with GDPR, the nation of China. How do you handle cloud and that whole asset discovery, in the modern, the modern cloud environment?
Yeah, I think it has to be a priority for your program, so that you, as a leader, you develop a vision and a strategy for your organization, and then you build that out into tactics and execution, and you hire people and teams, and you enable them with tools And tackling the problem statement that you just said is a multifaceted challenge, right? You need to have a technologist that understand the environment. You have to have security people that are validating the controls. You need to have attorneys and vendor management people involved so that you establish the right contracts with your providers to give you the right to audit if necessary, establish escrow accounts with those providers so that if something were to go wrong, you have access to the source code. So I view it as a multidisciplinary approach that requires teams working together with clear outcomes of understanding your environment and getting really clear on the nomenclature. Like, what do you mean by understanding? Do we know the IP address? Do we know the version? Do we know the source code? And all the various components that are ever expanding. Because earlier in our careers, we didn't really have to worry about Internet of Things. And now suddenly, the toaster in the kitchen has got an IP address and could be harnessed in a distributed denial of service attack, right? And so the sort of the scope of what we have to think about is expanding, at the same time becoming more complicated and complex. And I would differentiate that it's complicated when you have a series of steps, but once you master those steps, you can execute on them quickly. You can even automate them. But security can be complex, like predicting the weather, right? There are so many variables, it's difficult to predict. And so having this discipline and rigor to understand your environment, understanding the very solutions, the very technologies that are empowering us may also imperil us, right? We adopt open source software solutions. Fantastic. There's a lot of benefit to them. What about the underlying issues of having source code that's maybe supported part-time but by some volunteer? And all of that comes into play as you think about, how do I reduce fragility in my environment to develop almost an anti-fragile approach, meaning you understand your environment. When bad things happen, you're able to recover more quickly and you're stronger from the event itself.
So in the spirit of asset management, a lot of organizations, I think the executives and the board, they don't really appreciate that they enable proliferation of different kind of assets, right? When a board says, hey, you could have a Mac or a Windows computer, you just doubled the amount of complexity your IT people have to manage at that endpoint. And it's very similar when it says, oh, this group wants to host here at a certain, web hosting site. Maybe they want to host on Amazon. And then when you come into a problem that's nationwide known, like Log4j, a vulnerable library that's going to get included with everything, it just makes it really, really hard to answer that. So what can you say to executives who are starting a company or growing a company? What can you tell them about how to minimize that attack surface by maybe making some unpopular calls into what technology their organization can use?
Yeah, you're right, is that it's tempting to want to adopt the shiny object. But what I would challenge you is to think through, what's the total cost of ownership of adopting this shiny new object? What are the dependencies that I'm creating? What's the overhead, right? And have I thought through the impacts of this decision? Who are my stakeholders? Is it just the employees? But what are my investors going to think, or my board of directors? Apply what I would call second order thinking to your decisions that you're making today, and think about the trade-offs. Something I talked about earlier is that sometimes you'll get an immediate benefit of maybe adopting a new software solution or a new hardware solution. But again, applying second order thinking, what does that introduce into my environment from a supportability perspective? Am I going to have to add more headcount? Where will that headcount be located? What's that cost? What's that going to add to my burn rate? Right. So those are the things that I think you have to challenge yourself to think through as you're adopting new technologies. Again, I think as a CISO, I rarely wanted to be in a position to say no, even though you sometimes have to. I'd rather say yes and, right? And yes and gets you thinking, okay, there are compensating controls that need to be put into place, or compensating costs that I need to factor in order to enable the initiative that we're talking about.
Yeah, I specifically said executive and board members because, yeah, as CIO, CISO, it's hard to be the person who says no. You got to say yes and, which is really good. Uh, so I don't want to go into other chapters in the book because I'm encouraging people to read it. But I got to ask you, are you going to write another book? Did you have other historical sort of things of significance that you thought would make a good, good thing didn't make it? What are your plans going forward here?
Yeah, I wrote what turned out to be a 300-page book, and then the publisher and editors helped me kind of cull it down to a couple of hundred pages. So there are other chapters that I think are meaningful that maybe if I do a revision in the future, I'll add some of those chapters in. I'll probably blog about some of the concepts on nickshevelyov.com, maybe post it on LinkedIn. But there's definitely lots of other historical analogies that I see that apply to the ever-evolving space of technology. And there's also sort of critical thinking techniques, mental models that I think that we can leverage as all of us are looking to build out our toolbox, add new tools in, maybe sharpen the saw, so to speak, as the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, as our journey through our careers and lives go on. So yeah, there's definitely more material, and I'll use maybe a book update, some postings on my website and LinkedIn as well for those future publications.
Where you said the profits from the book are going to charity, which charity?
Yeah, so I start the book off with a quote from Winston Churchill that says, "We make a living out of what we get, but we make a life out of what we give." I wanted to pay it forward, and I wanted to take the proceeds and donate it to charity. And the charity is going to go to next gen cyber talent. Next gen cyber talent helps underprivileged, underserved communities get educated in cybersecurity. At one point in my life, I was a poor kid that could have had a helping hand. And so hopefully this will help someone improve their position in life, get educated in cybersecurity, help the good fight, but also help the industry as well. I mean, we both know that there's a huge talent shortage in cybersecurity. So hopefully a win-win for the industry.
That's phenomenal. So hats off to you for doing that. And I encourage more people to, give back. This industry has been good to so many people, and we need more people, and it's it's definitely well deserved. All right. So I encourage people to read the book. I encourage people out there in the video, they want to make a name for themselves. Take a book, talk to Nick, animate it. There is some really cool analogies here, and I spent a lot of time on YouTube watching videos about how people teach music and mathematics, and I think we need more stuff for cybersecurity. I'd very much encourage anybody to do that. So what I want to do, though, is I want to move on a little bit and pick your brain about certain cyber technologies. Now, as an investor, I say no to a lot of people. I get excited about what I invest in. As a CISO, as a CIO, as a Silicon Valley Bank, executive, you get to see a lot of different things. So I'm going to just play some word association here and riff on whatever technology I kind of talk about here. So the first one on the list, honeypots. What do you think of honeypots?
So, I talk a little bit about honeypots in the book. If you've got the bandwidth and the capacity, the people and the budget to set up honeypots, they're interesting. You can learn techniques from your potential attackers, right? And there are some more forward-thinking organizations and that have the capacity to do that have yielded great insights from honeypots, right? You set up an environment, the attacker goes in, they think they're in the real environment, you observe their techniques, you can feed those techniques into indicators of compromise, and you can upgrade your own posture to defend against that. That's great if you've got the basics covered first and foremost. If you feel that you've got asset inventory, complete. If you've got vulnerability remediation dialed in and you've burn rates are effective and you're not allowing toxic combinations in your environment. So I would prioritize technology hygiene first and foremost. And once you have that in place, and once that's continuously being validated, then exploring things like honeypots, which will give you deeper insights, which could feed into your cyber intelligence program. But make sure to get the fundamentals down first and foremost, and then you can start with the honeypots.
Cyber risk management platforms, maybe a GRC that manages a process, but something that takes in a bunch of inputs from your organization and calculates a risk score to let you know if you're doing better or worse.
Yeah, I think it's a tool in the toolbox. It doesn't abdicate you from making decisions for the organization, right? Now, you want to trust the qualitative analysis of your experienced leaders, right? There's no compression algorithm for experience. So trust the qualitative experience and balance it out with quantitative analysis. So, for example, factor analysis of information risk, FAIR, is one that companies are exploring. I worked with a gentleman named Doug Hubbard who wrote How to Measure Anything. He also wrote How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity with Richard Searson. And we worked on Monte Carlo simulations on probabilities of outcomes depending on situations. And then you have both a qualitative and a quantitative perspective. And then you're tying it into your first, second, and third line of defense within a bank. We're highly regulated. And so we have to make sure that we're using the same risk taxonomy, meaning high means high to everyone. It has the same definition and the same governance and actions taken should there be an output that says this is a high risk. Like something has to happen after that. It can't just get rolled under the rug. So I think there are tools in the toolbox. I think that you have to figure out your risk environment, your threat environment, your industry, and understand: are you part of are you a target, or are you part of an island hopping campaign? Is your industry being targeted? And three-letter agencies like the FBI, your local office, can give you some of those insights. And so that's a long-winded way of saying, Ron, that I think it's a tool in the toolbox, but there's lots of other components that go into it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you mentioned zero trust networks earlier on, and you had asked me my thoughts on it. I routinely run into CISOs who said, look, I've been building zero trust networks for the last 20 years, right? Minimum network availability, minimum privileges. I don't need to put a layer of encryption and tie it to some authentication to get zero trust. Now, it's interesting though, because if you can't build a network like that, I'm not so sure that buying a third-party product and laying it on top solves that either. But what are your thoughts on zero trust at this point as a market and as a buzzword?
Yeah, I think in terms of buzzwords, an example is we started with advanced persistent threats as something that a nation state would target you for an extended period of time. And it evolved into a broader terminology. Everyone's facing APTs. Today, we're using zero trust, originally something that Forresters came up with 10 or 12 years ago. And I think it was probably based on a white paper that IBM wrote around data-centric security models 20 years ago. But now in the industry, everyone's saying, well, we give you a zero trust solution. To me, it's principles of least privilege. It's really good hygiene. It's multi-factor authentication, the right people having the right access to the right resources at the right time. It's step-up authentication. It's privileged access management with MFA. But I would almost rebrand it. I would not call it zero trust. I would call it continuous trust validation, because based on your behavior, based on your role, based on the attributes associated with your role, if you go out of a certain parameter of typical behavior, that should trigger some sort of validation of non-repudiation. You are who you say you are. That's how I think of it. And I don't think it is a technology that you lay on top. It's a discipline that you build out and complement over the course of time.
I definitely agree. The cyber industry's done a bad job coming up with names, right? Most intrusion prevention systems were deployed in detection mode. Oh my gosh, most deep packet inspection, engines, look, the stuff that came before them looked at the entire packet. And, zero trust really means I trust the users, I trust the hardware I bought it on, and I trust the cloud that I'm going to. So, it's interesting. All right, let's do one more. Let's talk about indicators of compromise versus MITRE attack techniques.
Yeah, MITRE attack techniques, how an attacker might attack you, right? The offensive part of it. Indicators of compromise are clues that would suggest something malicious is occurring. So there's lots of different, you can have a threat feed that shows you indicators of compromise. You can be part of thought groups in the space. I'm a board member at the Bay Area CISO Council. Every third Thursday of the month, we get together, we educate each other on the latest techniques in the industry. Very helpful. We have special interest groups that are computer security incident response teams that are sharing real-time attack techniques. We all have feeds. The Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center offers you indicators of compromise. And so you look for a bad IP address that's been associated with other attacks. And you look at other behaviors and protocols that are being used. And so you add that into your security operations center monitoring and part of your threat intelligence so that you're always adding to that library and you're interrogating your environment to see if you identify any of those. So that's how I think of IOCs.
I think that's great. Are you running into CISOs who say that they have 100% coverage of their entire network from a MITRE attack technique point of view? They have enough hunting, they have enough net flow and enough telemetry from those endpoints that they think they can hunt 100% of the MITRE attack framework.
I don't know if I've heard anyone say I've got 100%. I think that the scar tissue that you build up over the course of time includes a degree of paranoia and humility where you understand you may think you have 100%, but you're never satisfied with that because you know that there are blind spots and you continuously look for 100%. So I'm not sure I've heard of anyone say I've got 100%. But I do know that it's the continuous journey of searching for, the environment that we're protecting. That's part of an overall program.
One thing I want to touch on before we get to the section of the show where I like to talk about science fiction and the analogies to cybersecurity. You've run a team, you've recruited a team. How do you handle burnout? How did you recruit? How did you promote? How did you motivate?
Yeah, so I built a team over the course of time with the philosophical approach is that we're all human beings. We have good days and we have bad days. I'm going to say what I mean and mean what I say, be good with my word. I care about my people. I want them to develop their careers, and I'm going to challenge them and give them opportunities and be transparent with the direction that we're going in. I'm going to ask for their advice. Sometimes I know exactly what I want and I'll give the request in to execute on it. Sometimes I know exactly what I want, but I have time. And in that time, I can develop critical thinking skills. So I use a Socratic approach and I ask questions. And sometimes I don't know the answer. I'll call it out. And it's the Spartan Agoge survival of the fittest logic. And that builds, I think, team alacrity. It's where people feel like they can have a voice, they can raise their hand, and they can be part of the solution. So that led to great engagement and retention on the team. And a lot of the people that reported to me over the course of time are now leaders of their own in other industries and other companies, and we maintain great relationships. So those are very rewarding. Burnout, I think that you need to factor in we've been in an extended period of a pandemic, and that if work and life blend all into one, it can feel like you're always working. And so I have forced vacations. Like I literally have forced people, and if they don't take it, I kiddingly, I'll turn off your access for a couple of weeks because I know you need it, even if you don't think you need it, right? Because we all need time to recharge. Adding a sense of levity and mirth to a space that can be pretty daunting at times, I think also adds to chemistry and a feeling of being part of something that's bigger than yourself. And so those are some of the ingredients that I've used over the course of time, where people want to come to work, enjoy it, feel like they're part of a bigger mission, and there's a feel-good story associated with that as well.
That's excellent advice. Another plug for the book. More than once, you talk about understanding the political situation while you're doing cybersecurity business, and understanding, kind of who's your ally and who's not your ally. So I'll just suggest people take a look at that. All right. So I like to talk about science fiction and how it kind of feeds into cybersecurity, and we're seeing this play out. So did you see the new movie Don't Look Up on Netflix?
I have not.
Okay. So no spoilers, right? But it's basically about an asteroid that's going to hit the Earth, and the journey that the people who discover the asteroid, do about informing people. And when I was watching this, literally, there's a scene in the White House with the media where they're talking, the asteroid is going to hit the Earth, right? I just felt like that was almost every CISO trying to like raise awareness about cybersecurity to the board. So, did you see any movies or anything that you draw from that you can point to other people outside of cyber that you're like, look, it's not like this, it's like that, when it comes to movies that are out there?
That's an interesting question. Maybe my favorite sort of science fiction movie of all time was The Matrix, the first one. And there's obviously some cybersecurity aspects to it there. You actually see Nmap in that movie, which is pretty cool. And you can kind of talk to, hey, this is how Neo was scanning the network and scanning for the Matrix, and this is how we think about looking at our networks. In terms of people screaming about cyber risks, what I incorporated was gamification. And I think we can learn a lot from games. And as a kid, I loved to play chess and other board games. And so what I did is to educate business leaders, especially for like our board of directors, is that I would take key components that I wanted them to understand, let them through an informational section. And then I had a game of Jeopardy, and I plugged in those sections at the top of the Jeopardy game. And then we played a game of Jeopardy with all the buzzers and whistles and boards. And people got really excited and competitive, and they learned. And at the end, I gave bottles of champagne to the winning team because in victory, you deserve champagne. And then I also gave bottles to the losers because in defeat, you need it. And so gamification analogies are something that I've used over the course of time. And so that's how I'd kind of summarize the movie section of the interview.
Are there any tropes in either TV or movies about hackers and cybersecurity that you had to kind of deal with, whether you're either recruiting people or communicating the risk of cybersecurity?
Yeah, there have been some TV shows over the course of time. I haven't watched them where people get some preconceived notions about cybersecurity, good or bad. And that this is what a hacker looks like. This, and so what I would say is, table your preconceived notions. Spend a little time listening and learning to, sources of information in the industry, and kind of understand that your cyber criminal could be someone subscribing to a service in a foreign country, who for them, it's just part of their economic benefit analysis, that it just makes more sense for them to do this type of work versus other work because of the economics of the country that they're in. And so when people start to dawns on them that, cyber criminal work as a service is available all around the world, you start understanding this is just part of sort of the world that we live in today.
When you look at some of the technology we've invented as a species, right? Self-driving cars, AI, Bitcoin, robots. What are you worried about? What do you think can go wrong? Because we clearly haven't solved cybersecurity. How does that interact with all that new technology?
Yeah, the very technology that empowers us may also imperil us, right? And so for every benefit that we have of a self-driving car, your imagination can run wild that a hacker can drive that car off a bridge, or you enable AI to do thinking on the behalf of human beings, and AI in a very matrix type way decides, you know what, human beings aren't good for the earth, right? And so it's just there are so many aspects to that, or Bitcoin, where people start feeling like that's more valuable than fiat currency, and how that throws economies in different directions. And so it's just such an interesting dynamic time in life that there are utopian sort of benefits to technology and dystopian risks as well.
Brave New World or Blade Runner, right? It's all good. How about, coming from having lived in Russia, we've got great power struggles between China and Russia today. Which one are you more concerned about? Maybe even from like a national point of view, and even from like your day as a CISO point of view. What impacts you the most?
I just think of it as an extension of geopolitical tension, right? And so I don't worry more about one versus the other. I think that as tensions heighten with a particular country, you're more likely to see cyber risks associated from that threat actor. And giving another plug for the FBI, your local FBI office can tell you what threats you're facing from different nation states. I think that Ray Dalio just published a book on the changing world order, and he talks about the fact that there's a change, is that the United States has been the global empire for the last 70, 80 years, and China is now very close, and they want to have their own sphere of influence. And how do we negotiate that peacefully without a hot war in the real world, which no one wants? But it plays itself out absolutely in the world of cyber, where there is a hot war between nations, intellectual property is being stolen, attacks are being played out. And then how do you manage things at a political level so those geopolitical tensions don't spill out into these other avenues? So that's a long-winded answer to what I think is an extension of geopolitical risk.
It's, the Gula Tech cyber military and geopolitical fiction show is too long of a title, right? But I kind of lump it all in fiction. Have you had a chance to read, Ghost Fleet or 2034, any of those books that talk about a hypothetical war between the U.S. and China?
I've heard about them. I haven't read them. And I sure hope that they don't play out, but it's plausible, right? I mean, every empire wants its own sphere of influence. And we have such dependencies on Taiwan, and China wants Taiwan to be back as one. And so I sure hope it doesn't play out as those books spell out, but it's plausible, right? And again, kind of going back to the lesson of the book, is civ invictum parabellum, those who wish for peace prepare for war.
That's excellent. Well, let's finish on a more positive note. So you're in your last 100 days at Silicon Valley Bank. Congratulations on a great 15-year career and what you've done for the community. Do you speak? Can you be on panels? Are you looking for that kind of, how should people contact you?
Yeah, all of the above. I'm at nickshevelyov.com or nshevelyov@gmail, either one. I'm still at the bank, nshevelyov@svb.com. And I've done all of the above. I've been a speaker at conferences and seminars and for boards. And so I'm doing some advisory work, looking at potential board opportunities, and also exploring what my next chapter will be. I really enjoy being in the space. It's such a fun space. I think I'll be in it the rest of my life because it's so relevant. And I think I used to think I was participating in the protection of the American way of life online, but now it's sort of like this has manifested itself into a protection of our way of life. And so I think that I'll continue to be involved in some form or fashion. It's so fun, fun space. So yeah, I'm happy to do interviews and panels and advisories and board consideration as well.
Excellent. All right, Nick, thanks very much for coming on the Gula Tech Cyber Fiction Show. And we will see everybody on the next show. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron.